diving into one of the highest risk control areas in any audit universe, supplier and third-party management. We'll walk through a full control testing work paper, from mapping the control across 6 major frameworks to design and operating effectiveness testing on Azure Active Directory and On Prem vendor systems, all the way to the final conclusion and remediation roadmap. This episode is brought to you by auditee.site, the AI-powered GRC platform. Let's get into it. Control mapping across standards. Stage 1 is control mapping, and this is where the efficiency argument for integrated testing really starts to click. One supply management control can satisfy up to 6 different frameworks at once: ISO 27002, A15, supplier relationships, SOC 2 calls it CC 9.2, vendor risk management, PCI DSS labels its requirement 12.8, GDPR India's DPDP law reference it as Article 28. Data processing agreements and NIST CSF spreads it across IDSC1 through IDSC5, supply chain risk management. So instead of testing this control 5 or 6 separate times or 5 or 6 separate audits, you test it once and map the same evidence across every framework. That's the whole point of an integrated GRC testing approach. Before we get into the actual testing, let's look at the shape of the work paper itself, because every control in this series follows the exact same 9-part structure. We start with the control objective, what are we actually trying to verify, then control steps split into design and operating, a sampling strategy, which for this control means at least 5 vendors, the evidence required, a step-by-step testing procedure, 8 design effectiveness checkpoints, 8 operating effectiveness checkpoints, then results comparing expected versus actual, and finally conclusion and recommendations. Once you internalize the structure, every work paper in this series becomes predictable, and that predictability is what makes testing fast and audit ready. Firstly, control objective. Here's the control objective in plain language: ensure that suppliers and third-party service providers are assessed, monitored, and compliant with security requirements. That single sentence is the anchor for everything that follows. Every design test and every operating test we run in this work paper exists to answer one question: are we actually doing that consistently for every vendor that touches our environment or our data? Evidence collection, tools, and steps. Now we move into design effectiveness. In other words, is the control designed correctly on paper before we even test whether it's operating? The tools here are vendor risk management portal, Think Archer, or OneTrust, a contract repository like SharePoint, or another document management system, and the Azure Active Directory vendor access policy. The evidence collection steps are straightforward. Export the supplier onboarding policy from the vendor risk portal. Screenshot the contract template showing security clauses, screenshot the SLA monitoring workflow, screenshot the data processing agreement template, and export the supplier audit schedule. Each of these becomes a piece of documentary evidence that a design element actually exists. Design effectiveness checkpoints. With that evidence in hand, we run it against 8 design checkpoints. Is the supplier onboarding process documented? Is there a defined supplier risk assessment methodology? Are contract security clauses documented? Is there a defined SLA monitoring process? Is third-party access control defined? Is the supplier audit process documented? Are compliance requirements like SOC 2 and ISO defined? And finally, is there a documented exit or termination process? If all 8 of these are answered yes, the control is designed effectively. Now we need to prove it's actually operating that way. Evidence collection, tools, and steps for operating effectiveness. That brings us to operating effectiveness. Is the control actually functioning day to day, not just documented? This time the tool shift towards live system data, the ServiceNow vendor module, Azure Active Directory access logs, and the SHIEM used to monitor vendor accounts. The evidence steps: export vendor risk assessment reports from ServiceNow, screenshot the Azure AD log showing vendor account access, screenshot the SLA monitoring dashboard, screenshot the supplier audit report, and screenshot the signed DPA copy from the repository. Notice the shift. Design effectiveness pulled templates and policies. Operating effectiveness pulls logs, dashboards, and signed documents. That's the difference between we plan to do this and we can prove we did. Operating effectiveness checkpoints. And here are the 8 operating checkpoints we test against where risk assessments actually performed. Do contracts include the required security clauses? Is the SLA actually being monitored? Is third-party access actually controlled? Where supplier audits actually performed? Are SOC 2 and ISO certificates validated? Are DPAs actually signed? And where exit procedures actually followed when a vendor relationship ended? These 8 questions are what separate a control that looks good on paper from one that's genuinely working. Test execution samples. Time to actually run the test. Our sample is 5 vendors, a cloud provider, a payroll processor, an IT support vendor, a data center, and a SaaS provider. A good cross-section of vendor risk types. On the design side, we review the onboarding policy for each sample vendor, inspect their contract templates for security clauses, verify the SLA monitoring workflow exists, check DPA template compliance, and review the supplier audit schedule. On the operating side, we inspect the vendor risk assessment reports, verify contracts are signed with clauses in place, check the SLA monitoring dashboard, review the Azure AD vendor access logs, and inspect the supplier audit report. So what did we expect versus what did we actually find? Expected, all vendors assessed, contracts signed, SLA monitored, audits performed, actual 4 out of 5 vendors assessed, 1 vendor missing a signed DPA, SLA monitored for all 5 but audits completed for only 3 out of 5. That gap between expected and actual is exactly what a control test is designed to surface. Workpaper example, supplier risk assessment. Let's put that into an actual workpaper example for the control supplier risk assessment. The cloud provider risk assessment report exists as expected, pass. The payroll processor assigned DPA was expected but it is missing, fail. IT support SLA monitoring is active as expected, pass. The data center and audit report was expected but is missing, fail. The SaaS provider contract clauses are present as expected, pass. So we write this up using the standard finding structure. Condition: 2 vendors are missing compliance evidence. Criteria: ISO 27002 A15 requires supplier risk management. Cause: vendor onboarding was left incomplete. Consequence: risk of non-compliance. Recommendation: enforce the onboarding checklist. Slide 11, documentation. Workpaper updates. Every control in this series gets documented using the same 5-part finding structure, so let's define it clearly. Condition is what was actually found. Criteria is the standard of requirement it's measured against. Cause is why the gap exists in the first place. Consequence is the risk impact if it's left unaddressed, and recommendation is the fix. Learn this 5-part structure once and you can write a clean defensible finding for any control gap you ever encounter. Conclusion, bringing it all together. First, the control effectiveness rating: effective, partially effective, or ineffective. In our example, this control came out partially effective. Second, framework alignment. Because we mapped this one control at the very start, ISO, SOC 2, PCI DSS, GDPR, DPDP, and NIST all reference the exact same evidence base. So this single test supports every one of those audits. And third, the remediation roadmap. The prioritized fixes we identified, like enforcing the onboarding checklist, get carried forward into the next audit cycle, so nothing falls through the cracks. And that's the full supplier and third-party management control workpaper, from framework mapping through design and operating effectiveness testing to the final conclusion. This series is sponsored by auditee.site, the AI GRC platform. Check them out if you want to see this kind of integrated testing automated. If this walkthrough helped you, subscribe to stay ahead for more audit tutorials, and we'll see you in the next one.